The assumption constantly being that Black women do not need to be cared for, which is why we say protect Black women, because even though we create these movements to protect ourselves, the culture has been created that we are not in need of this protection, and therefore you can treat us anyhow how and we can handle it. And we are completely rejecting the notion that we are strong and we can take it all. No, we can't. We're human. We are human. I know we do magical shit, but we're not magic. We're human. And it's important to really make space for that level of humanity, because that's what's ripped away from us, the experience of humanity, to be able to feel the fullness of feelings and be cared for in any way that any other human being would need to be cared for, whether it be in the hospitals, whether it be in educational systems, whatever institution you want to name it, we need to be cared for as well. Hey y'all, what is up? This video is one that I've been thinking about and, really contemplating for some time. Hashtag protect Black women. This way for the entire summer, and it's not new at all. But a lot has been coming up, and I feel like talking about it, having a conversation about it. And I've been thinking about how and when and what it is I want to say in this conversation. And I've decided to, just have it from an authentic place in terms of just sharing with you some of what's been on my mind about it. So my name is Tanya Turton, and I am a wellness educator and the founder of Mia Zamar. So I want to talk about why, this concept of protect Black women is so important and also historical and not new. I think that this month, particularly for Mia Zamar, we've been talking about tenderness and how to challenge the idea of being a strong Black woman. And in conversation with Sade, we really were thinking to ourselves, how did we get here? How do we get to a point where it feels important to, have not just important to have this conversation, but important to acknowledge that we feel we have to be strong. And we were thinking about the history of it all. We were thinking about how we didn't make up this whole strong Black woman kind of archetype, right? This was something that was imposed upon us, and much of it has come from how we haven't been cared for or protected. And it feels important, and I would be remiss, whatever, y'all, to not say that this is also a conversation about intersectionality and the ways that in our intersections we are forgotten and not cared for. And it's important that if we're having this conversation, we have it from an intersectional place. So when we think about intersectionality and what that is, let's start there in the why this matters conversation. When we think about intersectionality, we think about what Kimberly Crenshaw has offered to us. The much needed conversations around bringing our fullness to the table, but also how our full identities can be compounded in a way in terms of our experiences. So when we have a conversation about Black Lives Matter, how does different experiences of Blackness impact that mattering? So when we say Black Lives Matter, are we including women particularly? Are we also including non-binary folks? Are we including trans folks? Are we including queer folks? How are we ensuring that when we say Black Lives Matter, that means all Black Lives Matter? And then that therefore means that it's a collective conversation. When we talk about protect Black women, it's to be able to speak to the fact that even specifically how Black women have been at the forefront of many conversations around injustices, we are not always cared for, and we really have seen that. We've seen that in the ways that Breonna Taylor has still yet to really receive the justice that she very much deserves. We see that in what has happened to Megan Thee Stallion over the course of the past few months, how she has been villainized in this experience of what's actually happening to her. We see that in what happened to Rihanna. There's a lot of experiences and stories that we can go to, some that are famous and some that are not, of how Black women do not receive the same kind of care and protection, even in our movements for Black folks. But that is historical. This is not new. This is what we have been navigating for a long time now. I really think that in this conversation around protect Black women, what we're really talking about is how some of us are weary. I don't know about y'all, but I feel weary in it all. I feel weary in being in this work and doing this work. And I feel like that's kind of why I decided to take the route of creating these spaces specifically for us, because it feels like in a lot of spaces I it feels like in a lot of spaces that are created, it does not speak to our specific nuance. And then if we're talking about intersectionality and this idea of protecting Black women, specifically thinking about Black lives and how women, queer folks, trans folks, non-binary folks are part of this, conversation, then we have to take into account all aspects of our experience, the experiences of folks from different class, just various different backgrounds. And going back to this piece around how it is historical, what I started thinking about in this conversation around strong Black women and conversation about protecting Black women and say her name and all these threads, it feels like we're continuously having the same conversation, continuously and historically having the same conversation. Going back to some of the historical pieces around feminism, specifically how Black women specifically have been left out of feminism and how feminism has not offered us the kind of protection that we desire. And that's why folks like Alice Walker came up with terms like womanism, to speak to the ways that the Black woman experience is specific and unique in experience, but also a big challenge of it is that folks look to protect folks that they can understand or feel like the values are similar, so on and so forth, right? And what happens in feminism is, although it's actually in the best interest, if true feminism would be in the best interest of the equity for all women, and when I say women, I'm inclusive of trans women, I'm inclusive of folks who are femme presenting but may not identify as a woman, inclusive of these different identities. What happens specifically when we have a conversation about feminism is that it historically, and I would beg to say even current day, does really take on this embodiment of middle-class white women. So we talk about intersectionality and why it's important and how this is a historical conversation, right? And why when we talk about protecting Black women, actually we're talking about intersectionality, is because when we think about feminism and the ways that feminism has been centered around white middle-class women and has often left out Black women altogether, it speaks to the history there, the history of why we've had to be so mindful, and why we have had to develop spaces for us. So speaking specifically to feminism and how the first wave of feminism was specifically around voting rights, and those voting rights did not include Black women and what was necessary and needed for Black women at that time. And then second wave feminism came around. Second wave feminism was really around workforce stuff and really around what white middle-class women wanted and did not include race. And they felt like talking about race was distracting from the issue at hand, as well as for what we would call right now this third wave of feminism, which is things like the Me Too movement, while started by a Black woman, the ways that white women in white spaces, particularly white middle-class women, have really co-opted the experiences that even if this thing came from a Black woman, the ways and who got heard and paid attention to speaks really to white women, and how feminism has continuously catered to their experiences and what they need, oftentimes leaving Black women out of the conversation altogether. And there's a trend of that, right? There's a trend of things like the body positive movement. There's a trend of things that Black women create for ourselves and in the spirit of protecting Black women that become co-opted by white women and other women of color. Oftentimes this also happens, that then in how the rendition of them and how they develop leaves Black women out. So there's no wonder why we feel some type of way, why we feel weary, why we feel tired, because it's, when we say protect Black women, it's not that Black women are not protecting Black women and that Black women are not creating movements and spaces for ourselves. It's what happens when other folks grab hold of those movements and those spaces and then leave us out. Of course we feel some type of way. I feel some type of way that we create these things that then, as they pick up legs and grow and walk, we are seen as not deserving of said protection that we created it to protect ourselves and other folks. And that's the thing, we often are thinking about how we care for ourselves, but we are inclusive of other folks. So we create movements for ourselves, we allow other folks into those movements. When we create movements for ourselves and we allow other folks into those movements, what happens over time is, as they pick up legs and walk, we get left out of those spaces. So when we say protect Black women, it's not from a space of Black women are not already doing that work. It's from a space of really asking that folks honor our intention, honor our labor, honor our work, and honor the spaces we create by also being inclusive of us when we let them into those spaces. And let's be 100% honest, this is not just an issue around race, right? So when we talk about intersectionality, it's about the flip side of it. Because in movements where we have also had Black men a part of those movements, this similar thing has happened. And we're talking, this is also very historical. This is also very historical as well. We're talking as early as the Civil Rights Movement and how respectability politics really dictated who was cared for and protected in those movements. So thinking about inclusive of our movements with Black men, thinking about how respectability politics has decided which Black women are worthy of protection and care in these movements. So in the spirit of respectability politics, while it's true Rosa Parks did in fact refuse to move, Claudette Colvin also did that. But because of the fact that she had a child and the age that she was not seen as a good face of the movement. And the issue with that specifically, because I think that there is a history of also Black men feeling like we gotta focus on the race issue. We can't actually talk about gender. But the issue with that is the ways that Black women are not protected, which creates a culture of not caring for or protecting Black women. And that's the issue here, is that this then becomes cultural and sees itself passed down from one generation to the next, to be having this conversation about Megan Thee Stallion and other women who we can visually openly see are not being cared for and protected in the ways that they should be, because of respectability politics being part of it. Thinking about how Eldridge Cleaver wrote a whole book about it, you know, about the ways that it's okay to treat Black women lesser than, and that they will not be protected or cared for. So there are Black men who have said this, admitted to it, and have history of this conversation that we're speaking of. And we're not making this up. This shit's real. Our movements really have worked to silence folks and to require that they prioritize their Blackness over any of their identities, whether that be their womanhood, whether that be their queerness, whether that be their gender, the idea that Black comes first and that we should fragment ourselves in the interest of the movement, but oftentimes in the interest of Black patriarchy, in the interest of Black men, and ensuring that they get the justice they deserve, which doesn't always turn around and include the protection and justice of all Black lives. It's in terms of and some of this in terms of the history of it is really looking at how these perspectives around the Black matriarch ruining the Black family, and these perspectives around respectability politics, that there is a lot of propaganda that has been created to make Black women seem like we're not worthy of protection, and like we are not, you know, just as fragile and tender and in need of care. And this propaganda is particularly created about Black women in a way that's not created about any other kind of race or of woman, right? And this is part of the problem, is that it becomes culturally acceptable, not only in white spaces with feminism, but in Black spaces and Black culture, to perceive it as Black women not in need of care. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about because I know someone's gonna be like, but now all Black men. Of course not. But we're talking about what is the culture that has been created, and how is that culture making it conducive for certain things to happen that should not be okay. Because really that's what it is. It's the culture that's created, and how are we ensuring that the culture of our movements are specific and also inclusive. That we're saying that in this movement, when we say Black Lives Matter, we mean all Black Lives Matter. When we talk about feminism, we'll put it back there, we're talking about all women. That in any movement, the culture has to be one that is inclusive of all folks, and not simply one that is prioritizing the folks who already have access to power and privilege in that movement. Because what happens in these cultures is it doesn't just stay in the movement. These cultures, and I didn't say this, but I want to bring it back to this, that Black Lives Matter, specifically, again, a movement created by Black women, Black femme folks, led by Black queer folks, Black folks of trans experience. So even though we are, again, creating these spaces, the conversations, what happens when other folks enter the space with us who have access to power and privilege and then leave us out of these spaces. This is the conversation that we're having. And how does that trickle into what is allowed to happen in other spaces? When we talk about the rate of Black women who are, content warning, when we talk about Black women who experience violence, whether it be domestic violence, but also violence in hospital systems, also violence in educational systems, the rate in which that Black women experience violence and mistreatment. And when I'm thinking about institutions, I'm thinking about everything from medical institutions, I'm thinking about the music industry, I'm thinking about police, I'm thinking about entertainment, I'm thinking about how survivors are cared for. This is not just a one place type of issue. This is something that happens in so many different spheres that this is a conversation about the culture that has been created that perceives Black women as superhuman and not in need of care. And there's so many examples, like the example with Megan Thee Stallion, where a Black woman who's definitely in need of care and tenderness and grace and support because she experienced some traumatic ass shit is being treated as if she doesn't need any of those things and she's fine, she good, she can walk, she's fine. And we would not treat any other kind of woman that way. As a collective community, we would not talk about anybody else that way. So how is this actually internal cultural shift that's necessary to be able to do what we say we want to do, which is prioritize the experiences of all of our lives, right? And I think it's interesting too, because we see how, and I'm saying both back and forth because I think this is accountability for feminist movements and accountability for Black movements. I think that both movements are accountable for how they have really disappointed and how they have neglected the experiences, particularly of Black women. And when I say Black women, I want to be inclusive of Black femme identities and Black non-binary and gender non-conforming identities, because to actually be an equitable movement, it has to be inclusive of all the folks. All the folks' lives need to be important and matter. That I want to see is for Black women, Black queer folks, Black folks of trans experience, Black non-binary folks, Black gender non-conforming folks to be seen as equally as valuable as their Black male counterparts and also their white woman counterparts. Either or, both of the issues is the ways that folks in these movements utilize their power to leave us out. But I also want to say we do dope shit to take care of each other. And I think that we have been and we continue to create wellness movements that allow us to check in with each other and create care spaces for each other. We continue to create beautiful friend circles that give space to our humanness, to our tears, to our exhaustion, to our weariness, and we hold and support each other. And we continue to be at the forefront of a lot of these conversations, whether it's creating terminology like intersectionality or creating language that allows us to talk about what our experiences are. And we continue to do the work in really beautiful and meaningful ways and continue to support each other in creating safe spaces. So it feels important that in doing that, one of the things that we really allow ourselves to do is let go of the idea of strong and resilient and let go of the idea that we have to hold it all. Because personally, I'm over it. I ain't trying to hold shit. Like, where I'm at in my own wellness journey at this point is one of creating as much tenderness and as much care for myself and the folks around me as possible that allows us to exhale, allows us to, even though we've been taught that we're supposed to do it all, to know that that's not true. And we are also deserving of tenderness. And that for folks who do have access to power and privilege, whether it be through race or gender, that or sexuality or whatever else, that they are, I'm really hoping for folks to be more mindful and to be more active in their intention to be a part of a culture shift that does allow us to all be equal in, I don't want to say equal because it's not really about equality, because what does equality really mean, but inclusive to us all being valuable. We're all valuable, we're all necessary, we're all deserving of protection. That's that on that. Hopefully this conversation was helpful and contextualized some of the experiences, my 2 cents, as to why it's important that the culture shift is created and we become inclusive when we have conversations in our movements that then become part of our institutions. Love y'all. Peace.